Good morning, Year 8. So we're here to talk about Stephen Crane and his context, and the context of the book, The Red Badge of Courage. This is just like the previous video. You'll need to watch it, listen to the content, possibly make notes so you're prepared for your class, and then make sure that you take the quiz. So I'm talking about Stephen Crane, who is the author of The Red Badge of Courage. He was born in 1871 in Newark, so not New York, Newark, New Jersey. He came from an extremely large family, a Methodist family, so a Christian family. When I say extremely large, we're talking about 14 siblings, though not all of them survived. He spent time preparing for his career as a professional baseball player as a child, and had brief opportunities at higher education, studying at Lafayette College and Syracuse University, but he couldn't really stick either of those, and eventually fell into full-time writing as a journalist. He wrote about very real topics. He tried to avoid the romantic and possibly upper class topics for literature that had gone before him. A good example of that is he wrote a book called Maggie, A Girl of the Streets in 1893, and essentially that was a novel about a prostitute essentially, and he wrote about her very real life experiences and how difficult life was for her. So these aren't romantic figures that he's writing about, they're very real people. His most enduring work, so the one that he's best remembered for and that has lasted still and is still studied and read today, is the novel that we're studying, The Red Badge of Courage, and it was published a couple of years after Maggie in 1895. It wasn't initially very well received in the United States, and in order for you to understand that, it's probably because the literature about the Civil War at that point, about the American Civil War, was laden with bravery. And you also have to remember this is sometime after, actually, the Civil War that Crane put pen to paper. So there's all of that sensitivity around people who've lost their loved ones, not wanting it to be so honestly portrayed, because remember in the last video we talked about how he wrote in an impressionist but also in quite a realist and a naturalist way. So his depictions of war and battle possibly put off a lot of the American public, but actually the English really took to this novel, and that's where its success came from primarily. Because he was so good at describing war, he actually picked up a lot of commissions after Red Badge of Courage and was actually sent to Greece, Cuba and Puerto Rico to write about the actual wars happening then. He also had this most amazing event in his life. He was travelling to one of these destinations in order to cover them on a boat, and this boat got into difficulties and it sank, and he was one of the few survivors, and he survived because he got into a lifeboat, and they were stranded for days on end at sea in a very small lifeboat, and he wrote a short story and then some poems about it, and he called it The Open Boat, and it's a fascinating part of his life. So in 1899 he moved into a medieval castle in England, with his lover, who was a former madam, so actually a former prostitute, of a Jacksonville brothel, and he wrote feverishly hoping to pay for all the debts he'd acquired on his way. Sadly though, his health began to fail, and at the age of just 28 he died of tuberculosis. It's ironic, I suppose, that whilst Crane had an interest in the army and whilst Crane had talked to many veterans, he himself had never fought. So not only never fought in the American Civil War, he was in fact born a couple of years after it, so he'd never seen the action that he describes so vividly, but he'd never fought full stop, and his extraordinarily realistic combat scenes don't sit very well there. His strength of imagination and the power of his imagination really comes through when you realise that he's never even probably fired a gun in anger. Most critics actually assumed that he had been in the war, or that he was at the very least an experienced soldier. So to understand just how effective his realistic writing was, you have to realise that most people saw him as a soldier. The novel itself is based loosely on the events of the Battle the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was fought in May in 1863. Though neither the battle, the war, nor the armies are named in the book, so Crane deliberately doesn't specify it. It pretty much shattered American preconceptions, so America's fixed ideas about what a war novel could and should be. In the decades before Crane's novel, a lot of fiction about the Civil War was heavily idealistic. It portrayed the conflict as a great clash of opposing ideals, rather than being about battles and the blood and the guts and the gore. Writers had taken sort of large, epic viewpoints, and they'd written about grandiose, large-scale ideas, and they had talked about bravery, and they'd really talked about how amazing all these American soldiers were, whereas Crane actually puts real people into the situation and explores human weakness, and not cowardice as such, but definitely sort of the nature of fear. Crane really explores his protagonist's mindset. He tries to get into Henry's maze of illusions and vanity and romantic naivety, and explores that naivety, so explores that innocence and that romanticism and that escapism, and really pulls it apart and challenges it because of the hard lessons of war. He doesn't depict moral absolutes, so he gives us no certainties. He doesn't say this is right and this is wrong and that's how it is. So this is not a moral text as such. It's not as simple as that. Rather, he tries to portray sort of all the great differences of human experience and human existence. So this is what it is to be human, to try and find your own moral pathway through. And obviously that's much harder when you're trying to find your way through something as complicated and as terrible as war. He starts and he closes with really honest depictions of battle. The imagery of it is incredibly moving, but also there's enough ambiguity in these descriptions for you to have to do a lot of the work yourself. And there's definitely a real psychological focus. So this isn't just about the bullets whizzing past, but about how those bullets make him feel. This isn't just about charging at the enemy, but how charging at the enemy makes him feel. And he explores the fear and the really the powerful, gritty, controlling nature of fear in a really fascinating way when he writes, because he's trying to move away from the romantic or the very logical descriptions of war that had gone before. And he does that as a reaction to probably public opinion at the time, and the way that the American nation was trying to recover itself from this huge rift. I mean, the Civil War nearly tore America apart, and it's really one of its great sort of forming moments. It's when it became the nation that it became. And it was still recovering when Crane was writing. So what Crane was doing is very controversial and very moving, which is why the Americans didn't take to it so much initially. But now its context is one where it's read almost by every American teenager as a text. It's part of the way they see themselves, this understanding of war and courage and finding a way to be brave. Not just being brave from the outset in that kind of romantic way, but Henry very much finds bravery and finds courage